Hello and welcome to NIAGA Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. NIAGA Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now this week on analysis, we're discussing the sandwich generation crisis. Malaysia's sandwich generation, which is typically individuals aged 40 to 60, are facing dual challenges: financial pressures and the burden of caring for aging parents while also raising their own children. Now, this is particularly pronounced for middle-income households. This demographic is also disproportionately female, highlighting deep-seated gender norms and systemic gaps in care infrastructure. In fact, a 2025 survey revealed that more than 95% of elderly parents receive support from their children, which can encompass financial aid, personal care, and also household assistance. However, with life expectancy rising and birth rates declining, in fact, women's life expectancy increased by 17.3% from 1970 to 2017. This overall caregiving burden then intensifies. Notably, only about 5% of seniors have EPF, Employees Provident Fund, savings to last beyond age 65, which exacerbates financial strains on caregivers. Looking at also sandwich generation, men's well-being is also deeply impacted with financial strain due to dual responsibilities, which can result in emotional and as well as psychological impacts. There is then the scarcity of affordable quality eldercare services, which compounds these challenges for both men and women from the sandwich generation. NIAGA Spotlight today focuses on policy options, rights-based approaches, and also strategies to alleviate the sandwich generation's burden. I'm joined in the studios by Chai Senting, Senior Research Officer with the Malaysian Research Institute on Aging, My Aging at University Putra Malaysia, UPM, together with Dr. Fatima Al-Atas, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, International Islamic University, Malaysia, IIUM. A very good morning to the both of you. How are we doing?
Good
morning. Thank you for making time for us. Dr. Fatima, especially feeling a little bit under the weather.
Yes,
but,
a little bit.
All right, but let's start off the discussion anyhow. Chai, perhaps if I could get us started off with looking at Malaysia's policy frameworks and how can we actually reimagine them to not only address this growing economic strain, which is on the sandwich generation, but also looking at a rights-based approach. For starters, let's actually focus on an often neglected demographic, which is the challenges and unique pressures being faced by women and men in particular.
I think it's a good place to start as any because traditionally, even in government policies, the government has emphasized a lot on the role of the family in the care of older persons. Of course, children, that's by default. But the fact of the matter is that if you notice that many of our policies, including our tax breaks, are actually designed to help family members fulfill what we call the filial piety roles. So hence the tax breaks are given to adult children, they are given to claims of medical expenses of parents, even buying devices. In the last budget speech, the Prime Minister actually added a new tax break actually for elder care, whether it's residential or non-residential services, home and community-based care that could be deducted under the personal income tax. But on the other hand, the severe situation here is that we are in a transitionary phase. When we say transition, it means that some things that have been performed by women at home and now is being commodified, that would be the right word, or monetized. Yeah, I'm not going to say monetized, but that's just another word. But basically, this is the issue now because of financialization of our lives. You can see that we have more services provided by the private market, but families would have to purchase them. So it is a little bit like a situation where, you know, in the past we do not have public health hospitals, or in the past we do not have a pension system. All this has emerged, and this is expected of the government. So as time moves on, the population's expectations of the role of the state will change. Because in the past, we are not expecting the government to take care of the elderly. We are also not expecting the government to take care of children. But nowadays, we felt that, you know, falling fertility rates, increasing life expectancy, the state must do something. So you can see how gradually the government exploring through the new concepts like care economy. So that is why these things are happening in recent years, because the state's role is increasingly becoming in demand. to take over, I would say, to support families. And this is what's happening now.
Absolutely. I think that gives us a good lens into what some of the shifts and changes have been policy-wise. But of course, all the discussions around care economy have to lead to investments in a care infrastructure, as well as fiscal policies that allocate adequately. So moving from there, thank you for that, Chai. Dr. Fatima, can I ask about looking from, of course, a sociological perspective, the disproportionate caregiving burden on women? Let's look at what gaps are existing and what gaps that you feel can actually be overcome. Of course, this is not a short-term thing. Let's look at perhaps within a generation. How can we gradually shift the norms which disproportionately place the direct care, at least, on women in the Malaysian sandwich generation?
Thanks so much, Sam. I like that you highlighted the economic, financial, monetary issues, because I think what's happened to Malaysia includes those changes of how we live, because it centers around our lives or our social lives, right? How we live, how long we spend at work now has changed a lot in the last few decades. Maybe we used to think about work as a 9-to-5 kind of process, but now more people work beyond 9-to-5 process, and then the boundaries of work and life sort of it's very loose. People do extra work. There's TikTok 24/7 where people are buying and selling at the same time. So this is just like a broad look into what our lives look like. So people do gig economy work. So there's a variety of ways in which people perform paid work, but then there's also the unpaid work that still has to exist, because that's how we live. We all need care. We always need care all the time, from even before we're born until after we die, because care is something that is required for all of us. So we need to think about that in that way, that it starts even before we're born and it has to continue on even after we die. Somebody needs to take care of us, and we need each other in that way. So there's the economic shift, but then there's also the time, I would say, time poverty. We're losing time. We're not just, thinking about things turning into something that has to be paid always, but also thinking about how much time we're losing. And it's not proportionate to everybody. It's not the same. For some people, you give your labor and you get a certain amount. For other groups, you give this labor and you get this amount.
Yeah.
And then we're talking about the unpaid work, right? So then you're talking about gender, because before, when we think about life before, one person works, and that's sufficient to care for the family, so the other person usually does the unpaid care. So this is gendered in a way that usually the person that goes out to do the paid work is the man, and the woman stays at home to do the unpaid work. Whether it's equitable or not, we can always, discuss that. But now both members usually work. It's usually a dual earner family.
You do need to have a double income, given the cost of living.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
and wage depression.
Yes. So not only do we need to work more hours, more people in the family need to do paid work. But the care work was not ever talked about in terms of now who's going to do the care work, right?
Very true.
So for a long time, we've gone through this, what we call a cultural lag, where, even the women have gone into work, but men haven't really stepped up to take on the unpaid care work. So in terms of thinking about the future and how we want to see shifts, then we need to address that. Because we've been addressing we need to do the economic side.
Sure.
Women need to go to work, contribute to the economy, the family's economy.
Or not be the ones who stay out because of the existing or increasing care burden.
Yeah, so the shift now has to be that, now we have to look at how can we talk about this side, who's going to do this together? How do we incorporate? It doesn't take so long. It shouldn't take so long, because it didn't take long for girls to quickly, outdo boys actually in school and to enter the job market. But because we didn't address that part, we see women going back to,
lagging behind.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
So if we don't address that, then that happens. So I think in terms of thinking about the shifts, I'm quite optimistic about it. If we actually pay attention to it and we put, things together, actions together, I think shifts can happen in a generation. I don't think that it's something that is, too difficult. And I think that thinking of that being too difficult is what makes it something that why we haven't changed it, because we always think that it's something that's so natural to only women doing it. But if we think it's just about learning to do things differently, then we can do it quickly. I think it less than a generation.
Perhaps even, I think it's actually ongoing right now, because when you mentioned, you know, people living lives where they're doing gig work, which can also involve selling on TikTok, I was just thinking about how popular, for example, fathers who are actually social media figures who do care work around the home, how popular they become. I think it's speaking to an existing dynamic within households, as well as the fact that it is excellent role modeling. Yeah. So moving from there, Chai, I'd love to now look at drawing from what Dr. Fatima was speaking about. There is this gap, but at the same time, looking at the rising cost of living and increasing longevity, let's focus on Malaysia's financial policies. You've got retirement savings, the schemes, taxations and pensions, but what more needs to be done in a much more targeted manner as perhaps financial incentives for caregivers? And this is those who are already existing within our communities and in households.
As Dr. mentioned, I think the main issue here is that women often have to make a choice, you know, and this is unfortunate because care demands, care work demands are unpaid. So naturally, if you stay home and be a housewife and caretaker or caregiver, then you don't get any pension plans. So I understand the policy developments in what we call ISURI and SOCSO's Housewife Social Security Plan. So I think the government is cognizant, they're aware of these developments. You know, you can't at one hand say that I want to increase the female labor force participation rate to 70% or 60%, and at the same time you are not making provisions to secure their future, which is all women's future. But at the same time, there are also other policy options that we can consider, like a basic pension solution. Then it doesn't matter whether you have worked or you have not.
Right.
Global trends in pension reforms is to understand that everyone in the society requires some form of income protection and security in later life. So when you have these state pensions funded sustainably, then what you can see now is that people will have more options to say that maybe I don't need to work. I want to do care work or do something else. Then families have more options. But now families do not have that option. It all has to come out from the main breadwinner or the financial earning. And sometimes that's why both couples work. I think families are quite a resilient structure. I mean, in family studies, we say that the families make decisions that are the best for their situation. So when the government look at the statistics and say that, hey, how come our women participation rate is not so high? Maybe that's a symptom of the fact that maybe one person earning income is enough. Or perhaps I think the truth would closer to be, if I come out and work, it will be a left hand to right hand scenario. Where I make all my earnings, but I'm going to pay all the caregivers, childminders.
Exactly.
And that's not exactly cost efficient.
Exactly. And also observing the existing gender pay gap that quite often results in a so-called choice being made, which is actually one that exists due to structural issues. So what about any thoughts, Chai, on perhaps a means-tested caregiver allowance so that it can actually meet urgent financial needs, particularly for those who would be outside of urban areas, let's say rural areas, where also paying for caregiving due to accessibility and infra lack is not actually much of an option.
Yeah. We have 2 or 3 approaches. Currently, the Department of Social Welfare do give out Bantuan Penjaga Pesakit Terlantar, or BPT as they call it, meaning it's assistance for caregivers who take care of bedridden family members. But of course, this is means tested, as you mentioned, and it's only applicable to people from the low-income households. So that's one way of going about it. The other way we can think about is that think of the household as one unit. So you can actually adjust the what we call social accounting for that household, that particular household, in terms of its care burden. So how many disabled persons in the home, whether there's elderly requiring care, whether there are young children in the household, and you can do these adjustments to the income tax base. So let's say I live in a household where I earn, and then I'm taking care of 7 people, let's say. then perhaps the tax structure and treatment would be a little bit different. We don't need to collect too much info on how they spend their money. We only need to actually say that by default, this household is sustained by this income. And once the characteristic of the household is understood, that is why I say that we need to have tools such as family registries or household registries. We need this information so that policymakers can have more, I would say, precise interventions, rather than we say that you are a caregiver and then you have to apply. That works the other way around. You have to apply for it. And then that might be a hassle that some of them are not willing to make. And the cost of mean testing is another issue. So we have to think of solutions where they are embedded into the current system, like how the government just recently announced that probably the new petrol subsidy will be given through identity cards, our IC. So that's making use of a structure that exists, but how do they determine their eligibility?
Yes,
These are all
operationalizing the challenge, right? Yeah.
So that is why I said the Bantuan Pesakit Telantar is also not widely known.
Very true. Unless you're already working within the sector.
Correct.
So awareness matters.
Rural area families or households might find it to be quite a hassle to go and apply for it. And these are all limitations where we go by an application and a means-tested aid. These are some of the shortcomings. But
understood.
As a temporary stopgap measure, as something to alleviate the situation of care, this is where the Department of Social Welfare and the government should think about, can we expand this program? It's a little bit like the Bantuan Warga Emas. Yes, we don't have a state pension, but if we, in the meanwhile, while we come up with the pension reforms that probably will take time, maybe we can actually expand some of these programs to meet the needs of those households and families who actually are waiting or requiring public support, so that they don't have to go to the press all the time to raise funds or whatsoever. But there are mechanisms that we can put in place.
Well noted. Thank you very much for that, Chai. And drawing from what Chai was explaining, Dr. Fatima, of course we've got a huge lack of comprehensive respite care services. Let's think about how we can look at intergenerational care models and creating them so that those who are already within the elderly segment can also contribute via something which is more community-based to alleviating the sandwich generation's burden for care for children.
I really like this question, Tim, because I think when we think about intergenerational care models, we think about, oh, it's something to look outside, what other countries have done. But it's actually just going back to what we used to, and it's not that far away in the history of, how we used to live. We used to live...
The kampong feel, right?
Yes. And we used to live in a community where we take care of each other, and it's very common. For example, I asked my students in class, have you ever just gone to your neighbor's house and eat lunch? Right. That's something that seems very simple, but if you live in an urban area, it's as though you can't go to your neighbor's house and eat lunch, or your kids can't just go there without you being judged as being a bad parent. Similarly, in thinking about building communities like that, it's not really that far away from our culture, from the Malaysian culture to take care of each other, right? So it's really thinking about this concept of shared responsibility. So we can have a more institutionalized intergenerational care model. For example, putting preschools together with elderly care, which has been done in other countries, but also in thinking about our neighborhoods. And I think this is really important to think about how our infrastructures are being designed now and how we live. And I think we haven't put care into thinking about it and into the policies around how we build infrastructures, because we sort of separate socioeconomically where people live, and not every housing spaces are thought in terms of thinking about disabilities and age groups and care and how do we get people in and out, or whether it's child-friendly or not. So having a more inclusive kind of living arrangement for everybody brings the community together, because that's part of it. And thinking about, we want people to sort of live together so that we have better empathy, because we see people of different age group, different ethnicity, different socioeconomic, groups. So we learn to understand each other's problems. And I think some of these problems always are seen as solutions as soft, but these soft solutions are what we're missing. And that's why we have these problems we have today, because we haven't really thought about the soft parts. We're always thinking about, economic things. We're thinking about laws, but we're not thinking about how do we build the soft parts of our community and our societies together. So in thinking about intergenerational models, although we want to have the institutionalized ones, we also must work towards, you know, sort of
self-help.
Yes, self-help, but also, you know, making it come together again. How do we create environments where we can allow people to build that again so that we can let our neighbors' children eat at our house and we can ask how people are doing. You know, because I was always thinking about how now we build our houses so our doors don't meet the doors of our neighbors, so we never have to bump into each other. But bumping into each other is something we need to do, so we know who's living in front of us, are they well, how long have they not been at home, you know, things like that shows that we care about each other. And so if we're a country that thinks about that, then we would build that into the infrastructure as well, into the way that we live our lives. So we have time to ask our neighbors how they're doing, you know, to have time to check in on elderlies, and so to build that into our day in a way that it feels more organic rather than we have to ask for it. Yeah.
Or like a burden after all, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Chai mentioned the care burden. I hope that we can change the term into care value, you know, in terms of when we do our tax deduction, how much care value are you putting in? How many people are you caring for? So it's a value rather than a burden.
It's a perspective shift, I think, and particularly when you were speaking about fostering these intergenerational housing models, all I was thinking about was the fact that this was so common for anyone who's a full adult today. I'm talking about anybody maybe 30 above 35 years of age in Malaysia, to have actually grown up with this feel where your neighbors always directly knew where you were as the child of another neighbor, and this was never an issue. So perhaps not so much going back to the good old days, but trying to take away the best parts of it when it came to naturally caring for the community around us. But perhaps it speaks of a need to you know, launch perhaps even a small pilot project. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to federal or state governments. This could even be done on community initiatives, public-private partnerships, and once it is modeled, it receives the appropriate type of coverage in media and otherwise, we can see how it actually works in a practical manner to close those gaps.
And I think it also inspires the self-help part of our communities, because sometimes a lot of people who are part of, like, for example, the Surau community or the temple community, they want to do things, but maybe they haven't seen some samples of ideas of what can be done.
Yeah, but perhaps it's there in the memories of the adults today, and we can help rejig that again. Thank you. Thanks very much for the discussion so far, Dr. Fatima and Chai. We take a quick break now. We'll be right back with NIAGA Spotlight, looking at, of course, the sandwich generation crisis. Do you stay tuned? Welcome back to NIAGA Spotlight, still with me, Tamina Kauschi, and today we are analysing and looking at Malaysia's sandwich generation crisis and some measures by which the burden can actually be alleviated. So, Chai, let's go back into the conversation and looking about Malaysia's cultural attitudes towards caregiving. Of course, it is shifting, that it should be primarily only women who have these care responsibilities, but can policy interventions help to shift this, especially as, organically speaking, more men are also taking on these caregiving responsibilities?
Well, we have a lot of examples, actually. A geriatrician retiring early to take care of his mother. And we have many examples nowadays. But the core issue here is actually about whether men would be able to step up, not just in family-based care, but also in the care industry, meaning that we cannot assume, and by default, that the care workers will all be mostly women. At the moment, it's roughly about 60–70% from our studies. So, and they occupy different spaces, you know, so they usually are the supervisory roles or they are at cleaning roles where they require bodily, physical work. So the question here, of course, is also the value of care work at home performed by men, as well as self-care. They need to have some basic skills, cooking, cleaning. Those might not be direct care responsibilities, but they can at least alleviate some of the burden of a women at home. So I think at the end of the day, we now have a lot of what we call paid services, whether it's cleaning services or care services, as you mentioned. There's also a question of acceptability, affordability, and accessibility of these services, because the elderly themselves might not feel too comfortable being taken care of by a stranger. So these are expectations that has to be bridged. That means that, you know, adjustment comes from both ends, you know, not just the supply, but also the demand. So for the private market and households, the situation is really about how can we actually empower families, training family caregivers to take care of their own family members, because they lack resources, they don't know who to turn to.
Very
so
true.
Support
and care
groups,
needs are very multidimensional.
Exactly. Support groups are needed. ADFN has been excellent in doing it for dementia patients and family caregivers. But at the same time, we also need to actually professionalize the care workforce. And that's another issue. And that's something that we need some form of a standardization or registration, because we have spaces in the regulatory framework where home-based care is strictly not regulated. There's really nothing governing that.
No oversight.
No oversight. Yeah. So it creates this space where a lot of it is based on contractual agreements, based on trust, and, you know, try and error as we move on. But I believe that for the government to effectively support this space, you call it home and community-based care, then we need to also have a structure where we recognize these efforts by communities, by businesses, by NGOs to actually provide these caregiving help, not just to the elderly, even to nursing recovery adults, rehabilitation, or even child care. One of the biggest issues I feel is that we seem to think that over time, as families, you know, shrink in size, the responsibilities of care is actually increasingly becoming an issue within families. Then the real problem here is that perhaps that's the reason why fertility rates are falling. Perhaps that's the reason why people are not getting married. You know, they felt that, you know, am I getting married or getting into a trap while I'm getting married? So the question here is really about values. It's really about how the state is able to reframe and restructure. You know, they can't just be asking for increased female labor force participation rate without considering that how is it affecting the family institution in general. So I think over time, people, the masses, will be more accepting of state interventions. For example, we already have accepted EPF, you know,
That's
for
right.
so many years. It's almost unthinkable to not have them. But we are still taking some time and struggle to get the public to accept some form of a contributory health insurance or long-term care insurance. So these are structural developments that will come for us as a country, but I think it will take some time. So as mentioned by Dr. earlier, that we need some self-help approach, you know, that the community will have to work until the state, you know, is ready to implement some new measures or new solutions for families.
Absolutely. I really hear you on that, especially looking at the fact that it will take some time, but in the interim, Dr. Fatima, let's zone in on what was mentioned earlier, which is acceptability of care services and outsourcing beyond the domestic arena. Let's talk about what type of perhaps campaigns or public awareness could help raise it, particularly for the target demographic for this.
So I think when we think about acceptability, we're thinking about how care is perceived by the society, and it's very cultural, and it's also, when we talk about care, it's very personal. And I like that you already mentioned that care is not just thinking about elderly care, we're talking about child care, people who may be going through maybe short-term illnesses or maybe chronic illnesses, having children with disability. So in thinking about acceptability of the community, we can maybe think about childcare as an example, because we've had childcare for some time now.
Sure.
And I think in the beginning, yes, there are still some parts of our community that feel that, you know, rather than sending your child to a caregiver, it's better to have care at home. And I think it's not that we want everybody to think that paid care is better than care at home and care with family. Of course, there's value in both, and there's a necessity to have both, and you know, to be able to choose and have the choice of choosing both, but also to acknowledge that, number one, people must be convinced that there is quality in the care. I think that's why we had challenges with childcare, because we continue to have these challenges too, not just we had, but it's something that's still people having issues with it. It's because of the quality. And then the other one is accessibility and affordability, the other two. So we have to think about care in that way. But in terms of highlighting or addressing the cultural aspect, it's shifting the idea of saying that, or it's convincing perhaps certain communities or our family members, for example, in thinking about how we share love or how we communicate love with each other, because this is a very human aspects of our lives, and we're used to, in sociology we say doing love. You know, how do we do love and how do we communicate love with one another?
Cooking a meal,
yes,
acts of love,
yes.
right? Yeah.
So, but that shift, right, now, even if I buy Grab, you know, my children might not think that I'm a bad mom, and I'm not doing love labor, for example. But it's also rethinking those things. So that definitely takes time, because it's something that's very value-based and often generational value-based. So addressing those things, once we've addressed quality, accessibility, and affordability, then we have to talk about how we can, as a family, discuss perhaps in a more personal space how love is, you know, perceived, and how we can perform acts of love in other ways that may not look as how we are used to because of shifts in our lives and how we live our lives today.
Exactly, and that was actually making me think of the fact that, let's say, take out food, but that also costs a certain monetary value, and that is hours spent because you love the family that you're providing for. Yeah, so much to think about. Very interesting discussion and so far. Chai, let's go into looking at social enterprises or PPPs, public-private partnerships, which could be developed in Malaysia to support the sandwich generation, or there are already some existing models, perhaps in their fledgling stages, which NIAGA has been made aware of, and thoughts on this.
I think it's fantastic that private-public partnerships are happening. Petronas have been organizing a few series of social innovation competitions and incubations for social enterprises and startups, where they try and provide, you know, innovative services to the community on a sustainable model. It's not NGO-based approach, but it's more like a business approach, so that it's sustaining. And from these incubations and startup work, we have now a few of them, Teman Malaysia, where there's Jom Makcik. So all these are new ways of doing care work, you know, or presenting care services. And the success of Grab and the idea of, you know, on-demand services models have brought some change to the way we think and approach the problem. Even at the Institute, we are now actually trying to pilot a Meals on Wheels program for seniors.
Okay, and what would that look like?
Yeah, and of course we have them. We have the food service that families subscribe to, Mangkok Tingkat, that you can actually get food catering on a daily basis. And you also have what we call soup kitchens, you know, where Kuchara or some of the charitable groups distribute.
Tiratana Welfare Society, another good example.
Distribute free food to the needy. So our idea here was that you have new technologies like rethought packaging. Rethought packaging meaning that you have food that are sealed and they can last longer, and the shelf life is longer, and you can just leave it outside. You don't have to have a fridge. So reheating is just about putting in hot water or putting in a microwave. So the idea is that, is there a way we can deliver such Meals on Wheels program more efficiently, more effectively? So for example, we don't have to go there every day. So you reduce the cost of traveling. And you have all these pre-cooked, ready-to-eat meals that the elderly can choose from. and you can deliver it to them, and oh, they can sort it out. When do I want to eat it? And it won't go bad immediately. And there's no preservatives, because the rethought packaging is really about high heat, high compression food preservation. So the idea here is that for us researchers, we are always constantly trying out different ways to improve existing models and structures, and hope that if it works, if it's proven to be viable in terms of cost, in terms of manpower, we can actually introduce something new, new way of doing things. So I think we are very thrilled with the social enterprise space, because even existing care providers are thinking out of the box, because they might be running a residential daycare facility for an elderly or whatsoever, but they now say that since I'm already doing it, why don't I offer home-based care? Why don't I offer community-based care, respite? And some of them go as far as actually thinking about a new business arm, you know, trying to do among the homes to run some activities or provide industry services to one another. So I think these are all very positive developments, and only made possible because there is a network. And there is an understanding that we have to collaborate, and the demand is always there. The real question here is, how do we come in, as you mentioned, in a culturally acceptable way? And when we first organized the first convention of caregivers, residential caregivers, we have heard so many interesting ways of doing the business. Some of them actually only operate from Monday to Friday.
Okay.
And then they said, you can take your parents home on Saturday and Sundays. You know, and some of them gave very interesting perspectives that, oh, the family have to be responsible for the medication of the elderly in our center, because they say that at least they'll meet their children, at least they'll meet their family, or else if everything is being done by the service provider, they'll probably just pay through a bank transfer, and they'll never follow up or have interactions with their family members.
So encouraging a continuum of some care, right?
So I think that's where, you know, cultural shifts are really difficult. You need to get the people to say that, oh, abandonment is when you put an elderly in a home. But it is not abandonment when you put an elderly in a facility and you constantly visit them on a daily basis, or even every weekend, because you believe that professional care and help is much better than them being left alone at home without supervision. So I think these are narratives to be had, but at the same time, we must make sure that the industry provides the service. We should not abuse it, or we should not say that it replace certain roles of the family. Similarly with the state provisions, it should not take away from the role of the family, the kinship relations, and the expressions of love. The different ways of expressing love, you know, in the past and today is probably very different. In the past, probably they say that you must stay together with the seniors. But with modern housing limitations, it could be a challenge. Yeah, it could be a challenge. It's probably better that you live nearby, and then you have a lot of support. You might be even staying overseas, but you, as all those good ads tell you, if you call your parents via Zoom or whatsoever, that's some form of expression and maintaining of social relationships.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's also about harnessing existing structures and ensuring there can be some continuity to it. Dr. Fatima, to sort of close out and round off this discussion by refocusing again and looking at the impacts mentally as well as physically, specifically on men from the sandwich generation, what kind of community role can be played to alleviate this noted increase and uptick, especially in the past few years, and it's only going to go ahead and become even more pronounced in, let's say, the next decade or so?
I think when we talk about men, what's interesting is that when we saw the shift of women going to work, and that why the cultural lag was able to happen was because women can still take on the extra care. But when we're talking about the sandwich generation and women, you know, also going to work, then, you know, it's really to a point that we can't do this unless we share the responsibility. So then the question of men being part of the conversation becomes really, really
urgent.
Urgent. But at the same time, we have to think about also the structures, whether we have thought about improving the structures around it in terms of ensuring that leave policies, for example, also include men, that men also like women, have options to, leave work for a while. In fact, Malaysia's been talking about flexible work for a long time, but always the focus is always on women, that mothers get to take flexible work. But we still need to do some work on our flexible work arrangement. For example, in some countries, they have a right to request for certain hours. So people don't need to totally get off work. You can work, for example, instead of 40 hours, 20 hours of work a week, and still have an income and still have that social engagement and intellectual kind of fulfillment and all of that, and then still 20 hours be able to do the care work. And if you have 2 siblings or 3 siblings, then you could share that, and that becomes very doable. So even if a son wants to take care of the parents, or a father wants to take care of the son or the children, then this becomes something that's doable. So in terms of structure, the structure of policies must be present in order to address that. But I think more than policies, what we've seen in other countries, there are similar in terms of our culture, is that cultural stigma around breadwinning and men bringing an income. So it's really addressing that, and that has to do with a lot of issues around masculinity, because also part of the expectation is men don't talk about their problems, men don't confide in others. So it sort of puts men in such a cramped space that, they have a guilt of wanting to take care of their elders. Maybe they want to now. There's more realization of the role of fathers at home. They want to be part of their children's lives as well. But at work, they're expected to, fully be on board.
To not be the one who leaves, even though you are also a parent.
Yes, and not to maybe also discuss in spaces where it's, friendly spaces to talk about, hey, I have a problem with trying to manage. Women have these conversations all the time, and we sort of take care of each other in terms of, sharing notes or telling, this is what you can do, and, confiding each other.
Managing that mental, emotional load.
Yes, so addressing that need as well. So it's recreating the narrative for men, and I think I feel quite optimistic when we look at studies of millennial fathers or fathers in this generation. They're rethinking what fatherhood means and how they're doing fatherhood. And if we're thinking about the sandwich generation, we also have to hope that, or we have to sort of design a space where this is more encouraged, that support groups for sons taking care of elderly parents are talked about, and what are the resources available for men to reach out, so that we create this environment. We're so connected, yet we're disconnected. We have our phones with us all the time, but we just have to sort of create this environment. If we don't meet face to face, at least we have a group of men who are able to talk to each other about the load and how they can, because we haven't talked today a lot about the caregiver load and the toll of the caregiver. So maybe just briefly to address that, because that's a very real concern. And before this, we've talked about a lot of issues relating to women and securing women's social security and ISURI and all of that. But if men are to take on these roles, and I think this makes it better and easier for us to think about as a whole, that it's not just a women's problem, it's a caregiver problem, and this includes...
And it's a social issue. Dr. Fatima Chai as well, thank you so much for a really interesting conversation, and we hope that your key expert insights and policy recommendations are taken not just bit by bit, but as a whole. Thanks a lot for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for today on NIAGA Spotlight, focusing on the sandwich generation crisis with me, Tamina Kausji, and panel experts. We'll see you again next week with more economic analysis. Here's to a productive week ahead.